Good day, and welcome to today's VolitionRx Limited webcast as part of the Planet Microcap Showcase. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Head of U.S. Investor Relations and U.S. CFO, Scott Powell of VolitionRx Limited.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to today's VolitionRx Limited presentation. We're pleased to be back at the Planet Microcap Showcase and appreciate all of you who have dialed in for today's presentation. We are VolitionRx Limited. We are traded on the New York Stock Exchange American Exchange under the ticker VNRX, Victor, Nancy, Robert, X-ray. We'll move to slide 2 so that you can see our forward-looking statements and disclaimer, and note that I'll be making some forward-looking statements on this call, which may or may not be materialized in the future. A little bit of our investment highlights here. What does VolitionRx do? We are a diagnostics company working primarily in blood, developing tests primarily to screen for different cancer types, but we've also over the past year been expanding our diagnostic tests to look at non-cancerous diseases as well. And I'll talk a bit more about those later on in the presentation. If we take cancer screening and look at it from a high level, it may surprise many of you that there really are not many blood tests that are used to screen for most cancer types. So if you think about the screens that we currently utilize to screen for various cancer types, it tends to be X-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, mammography for breast cancer, of course, biopsies for a number of cancers, for instance, lung cancer, pancreatic cancer, colonoscopy for colorectal cancer screening. The only blood test that's in common use as a frontline screen for any cancer type is the PSA blood test for prostate cancer in men, and that test is not very accurate on its own. And if we look at a lot of these screens, many of them suffer from a variety of limitations. Many of these screens are invasive, expensive, can actually cause harm to the patient. Many of them are much better at late stage cancer diagnosis than early stage, and that's of course the inverse of where you want to be when it comes to cancer screening. Of course, catching most cancers early improves outcomes versus catching cancers at the later stage. Blood is a very interesting modality because it is convenient. It's very easy for a doctor or a nurse to draw some vials of blood from a simple venipuncture. B, it's very compliant in nature. Most of us generally comply with our blood screening obligations. Most of us give blood on a regular basis, whether it's for our annual wellness check or whether it's for blood drives, whether it's for other types of screening. And C, it can't harm the patient. Generally, the worst that happens is you have a sore arm or maybe feel a bit dehydrated or perhaps faint in the worst instance. So it's really a diagnostic modality that really can't harm patients. So those are three of the very important advantages of working in blood and with a blood-based modality. Now, we are working in both human health and animal health, and we became a commercial stage company late last year with the launch of our first animal health product, our Nu.Q Vet Screening Cancer Test. And most of you on this call are probably interested in hearing about our first commercial product, so I'll focus on that first, and then I'll talk about our human health clinical studies in a variety of other human health cancer types. So I'm just going to skip ahead on the slide deck to slide 15. And as you can see here, this is our Volition Veterinary Diagnostics Development LLC subsidiary. And within the subsidiary, we've launched our first commercial product called the Nu.Q Vet Cancer Screening Test. And we move to the next slide. You can see some of the statistics here. It's a very large and attractive market for us. You can see that 38% of all U.S. households have a canine, and that equates to about 77 million canines in just the U.S. alone. Below that, you can see that about 20 million canines are age 7 and older, and 83% of all canines visit the vet at least once per year. And then you can see the two circles on the right. There are about 6 million cancer diagnoses in canines each year compared to about 1.66 million cancer diagnoses in humans. That's not because of a necessarily greater prevalence of cancer in animals versus humans. It's a function of the shorter lifespan of canines vis-a-vis human life expectancy. And actually, the 6 million cancer diagnoses probably far underestimates the actual number of canines that suffer from cancer each year, because in many cases, your canine gets sick and dies without a confirmatory diagnosis of what the ailment was that actually caused the canine to perish. And of course, you're not going to perform an autopsy on a canine after it dies of unknown circumstances. So this 6 million number is probably a significant underestimate of the opportunity. Where will we position this blood test in screening for canines? So it could be positioned primarily in two different ways. One would be as a screen for symptomatic canines. So, for instance, if your canine is of a breed that's predisposed to one of the two cancer types that our blood test thus far can detect, and your canine is sick, predisposed to one of these two cancer types, it could be a candidate for our Volition blood test, basically to rule in or rule out cancer, because vets tell us that the challenge that they have when a canine presents with symptoms is that they have a very difficult time differentiating between cancer, inflammation, and infection. And so what often happens is upon the first veterinary visit, oftentimes the veterinarian will just kind of look at the dog and kind of feel and observe both with his or her hands and with his or her eyes and kind of figure out what he or she thinks might be causing the particular ailment. Might often prescribe the canine owner with some pills to put in the canine's dog food and hope that that is treating the underlying causal factors. In many cases, it is not treating the underlying causal factor because they're treating for the wrong symptoms. So oftentimes what happens is your canine still is sick after week after week after week, and you go back for a second or a third visit to the veterinarian, and then the veterinarian may start to run some more advanced diagnostic tests. These would often include MRIs, CAT scans, X-rays, potentially biopsies of different parts of the canine. And of course, these get expensive and invasive. In many cases, the canine has to undergo anesthesia, which, just like with humans, some canines have adverse reactions to anesthesia. So now all of a sudden the doctor doesn't know really what's wrong with the canine, and so this vet is running a whole bunch of different diagnostic tests to try and figure it out. Obviously, it's not a very targeted approach. It can be a very expensive process for the pet owner because generally most Americans do not have pet insurance, so most of this is out of pocket for a canine owner. And what happens is you don't have very targeted diagnoses. You finally may have a definitive diagnosis. At that point, the dog is given a particular therapeutic regimen, perhaps. But this all can be very expensive, is not very targeted, and unfortunately some time has lapsed. And in this case, the cancer may be progressing from an early stage to a later stage. So this would be a very useful tool for veterinarians to use when the canine first presents with symptoms, because it could rule in or rule out cancer. Therefore, the targeted diagnosis can be more targeted to a cancer or non-cancer causal factor, and then treatment can begin much sooner. And obviously, with this faster diagnosis and faster treatment administered to the canine, outcomes can be improved. So a very useful tool there. And you can see the market size is pretty significant. The second usage for our blood test for canines would be if you look at the the third line here with 20 million canines age 7 or older, could be as a wellness check for canines upon turning age 7, because 7 is the trigger. That's the age at which most canines become much more likely to develop cancer than canines under age 7. Right now, unfortunately, the vast majority of canines when they're diagnosed with cancer, it's because they're symptomatic. So there really aren't many, if any, good screens to screen for cancer prior to a canine being symptomatic. And this would be a major and very important tool for veterinarians to use because rather than waiting to run these tests after the canine is sick, and if the canine is sick because of a cancer, it's almost invariably a late-stage cancer, and the canine doesn't have a very good prognosis. So being used as a wellness check when the canine turns age 7, then again when it turns age 8 or age 9, or maybe even multiple times a year, would be a way to identify and catch these canine cancers at a much earlier stage, thereby reducing costs of diagnosis and therapeutic treatment to the canine owner, costs to the healthcare system, and also improving outcomes and saving lives for many of these canines. So really excited about the launch of this product. Sales have just commenced. Really, the first full month of sales was in December. First full quarter of sales just ended March 31, so we'll be reporting those sales figures when we announce our Q1 earnings. So a very interesting and large opportunity for us, and not a lot of competition out there. If we move to the next slide, you can see some of the economics here. In 2019, we formed our veterinary subsidiary. We collaborated with Texas A&M at the same time, and in 2019, we granted Texas A&M University a 12.5% equity ownership stake in our wholly owned subsidiary. In return for granting them the equity stake, Texas A&M ran the clinical studies, presented the clinical data, and now is our exclusive sales agent for this Volition blood test. It's for sale exclusively on the Texas A&M gastroenterology website. So the economics are such, it costs Volition well under $10 to produce the blood test. We're contractually obligated to sell it to Texas A&M for $45 per test. Texas A&M sells it to veterinarians for $122 per test. And then the suggested retail price that veterinarians are asked to sell to canine owners is $160 to $200, although we're seeing some vets sell for over $200. So good margins all around, both for us, for Texas A&M, and for veterinarians. And you can do the math. If we sell 100,000 tests next year, it's $4.5 million in revenue. If we sell 1 million tests, it's $45 million in revenue. So to Volition, so you can do the math. It is a significant market opportunity for us. How is the test performing in the clinic and in the real world? If we go to slide 18, you can see our clinical data from the studies that we ran at Texas A&M University's Veterinary College of Medicine. On the left, you can see the first canine cancer that we identified through our blood test. It's canine lymphoma. And on the right, the second canine cancer, hemangiosarcoma. You can see the area under the curves are very high. You break out the area under the curve into sensitivity and specificity. Sensitivity is your false negative rate. Specificity is your false positive rate. Most tests are false negatives and or false positives. With canine lymphoma, we were at 74% sensitivity. What that means is we accurately identified 74, or about 3/4 of all canines with canine lymphoma. At 100% specificity, you subtract that number from 100, gives you 0% false positives. So 26% false negatives at 0% false positives. So highly accurate test for canine lymphoma. Even more spectacular results for hemangiosarcoma. As you can see, 100% specificity, or no false positives. 89% sensitivity means only 11% false negatives. So we only missed just over 10% of canines with hemangiosarcoma, accurately identifying almost 90% with this very common cancer. These two cancers account for about 1/3 of all canine cancers, and these are two of the very most common canine cancers. So not only is our test accurate, it's accurate for very common canine cancers, and it is commercial stage. So very excited about this vet product launch, and hopefully all of you will continue to follow our sales, hopefully our sales ramp over the course of this year and beyond. We've also announced publicly that we are interested in signing a licensing deal with a larger animal health diagnostics company to license this blood test to them for national and or international sales. As we've mentioned publicly on our earnings calls, we're in active discussions with a variety of entities, and it's possible that we may sign a licensing deal with one or more of them. Of course, that remains to be seen, and we will only do it if terms are very favorable to Volition. Otherwise, we will likely hold off on that. But that is our veterinary product and our first commercial product. You can see canine lymphoma is a blood-borne cancer. So while we were getting really good results in canine lymphoma, we decided to look at a variety of lymphoma and leukemias in human health. And here I'll pivot to our human health clinical studies. You can see from slide 20 here, blood cancer in humans. And you can see about 700,000 cases of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, acute myeloid leukemia, and ALL globally each year, resulting in about 400,000 deaths each year. The challenge, again, with these lymphomas and leukemias is that the symptoms of these blood-borne cancers are nonspecific and are often confused with other less harmful causal factors. So, for instance, some of the symptoms are being lethargic, having migraines, being really tired, having aches and pains, and those could just be associated with the person being dehydrated, malnourished, overworked, not getting enough sleep, etc. And obviously those causal factors generally are not lethal. However, these same symptoms are also associated with a number of blood-borne cancers, which are lethal. And the challenge is identifying, ruling in or ruling out these blood-borne cancers. So what we are doing this year and next year is launching one or more large studies in the United States to look at a number of these leukemias and lymphoma, blood-borne cancers, and ideally being able to identify a number of these common ones so that we could position our blood test as an adjunct or a companion test to aid in the ruling in or ruling out of these blood-borne cancers when a person presents with these very nonspecific symptoms. So you can see the huge advantage to having a test like this because if the causal factors are from non-lethal symptoms or conditions, then obviously the doctor and patient can rest assured that the person can probably just go home and rest. However, if it comes back as a positive test early on in the presentation of these symptoms, further investigation and a full diagnostic workup would be generally required. And if it is a blood-borne cancer, treatment can begin really early on. And again, catching these blood-borne cancers early is critical in improving outcomes and saving lives. So expect additional information as we enroll and launch these larger clinical studies in the United States in these blood-borne cancers over the course of 2021 and 2022. Continuing on human health, and you can see here in a couple slides some of the clinical data. I won't spend too much time on that because I think we're kind of getting down to the last few minutes of the presentation here. But we've also had clinical data and currently have clinical studies in colorectal cancer as well as lung cancer. Lung cancer, a blood test for this. This is the most common cancer in virtually every country globally is lung cancer. Colorectal is generally the second leading cause of cancer-related death. So by looking at colorectal and lung, these are very large markets as well in the human health side of the marketplace. With lung cancer, it's a similar challenge as it is with identifying blood-borne cancers in that when a person is suspected of having lung cancer, typically it's a low-dose computed tomography or a CAT scan, an X-ray of an image of a person's lungs, and then the doctor has to interpret the image, and he or she has to then determine whether or not any of the nodules on the CAT scan appear malignant. The doctor may then recommend the patient go on for a more invasive lung biopsy. Unfortunately, 15% of the time, a lung biopsy causes a collapsed lung. So this diagnostic procedure can cause harm to a patient and in some cases could actually be lethal. So you can imagine that doctors are very cautious when they're interpreting the image, the CAT scan, and a lot of times they don't send the patient on for a lung biopsy because they're worried about the side effects of the biopsy when in fact the person does have lung cancer. And unfortunately, if the patient doesn't have a definitive diagnosis, treatment can't begin. Therefore, the patient is sent home and maybe has another CAT scan in 6 months or 12 months. And over that period of time, of course, the cancer could be metastasizing, progressing to a later stage, and obviously causing a lot more harm to that patient. So if the doctors had a tool like a Volition blood test that could be sort of a gatekeeper between the CAT scan and a lung biopsy, again, that would be a very useful tool for doctors, because it would help them in making that determination whether or not to send a patient on for a lung biopsy or not. And obviously there's risk either way, right? There's a risk of a collapsed lung by having a lung biopsy, and there's a risk of the cancer progressing to a later stage and or metastasizing to other organs if they don't have a lung biopsy. So this would be a very, very useful tool to aid in the diagnosis of lung cancer. With colorectal cancer, it's a different problem. And we would position this blood test as a frontline screen, sort of alongside the colonoscopy, a fecal test. Some of you may be familiar with the fecal immunochemical test, or FIT, or the Exact Sciences product, their Cologuard fecal test. We would want to position our blood test in a similar frontline screening fashion. The problem with colorectal cancer is not that we lack a good screen. The definitive screen or diagnosis is a colonoscopy, which is about 95% sensitive, so highly, highly accurate test. The problem we have with colorectal cancer is one of compliance. People generally don't enjoy, for obvious reasons, going for a colonoscopy procedure or the prep that's associated with a pre-colonoscopy procedure. It's an expensive procedure. It's invasive. It requires a lot of preparatory work. You generally have to go under anesthesia. You can't drive yourself to or from the procedure. Someone generally has to accompany you. So for all these reasons, many Americans, many citizens globally refuse to get screened for this very common cancer type. And this is a major problem because colorectal cancer is an easily identified cancer through a colonoscopy. It's easily treated at the same time. They generally will resect any precancerous polyps or cancerous lesions at the time of your colonoscopy. And it's a very slow-growing cancer. If you're negative through your colonoscopy procedure, you generally don't have another one for 10 years. That's how slow-growing the cancer type is. Unfortunately, A, it's an asymptomatic cancer early stage, and B, only about 62% of Americans are compliant with their screening obligations for colorectal cancer. And so for many Americans, they will not get screened at age 45, which is the new screening age guideline for people who are asymptomatic without a family history. And so some of these people will go into their 50s, 60s, 70s, never having had a colonoscopy, and then suddenly present with symptoms that really don't go away. And unfortunately, just like we talked about in canine health, if you're presenting with symptoms of colorectal cancer and you finally go for that colonoscopy and it is confirmed to be colorectal cancer, it's invariably stage 4, and your outcome is not good. If you're diagnosed with stage 1 colorectal cancer, you have a 90% chance of surviving more than 5 years. If you're diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer, you have a 93% chance of dying in the next 5 years. So early detection is the key, compliance is the problem, and a blood-based modality largely solves that compliance problem, because while people may refuse to comply with a colonoscopy, those same individuals probably would not refuse to comply with a simple blood test if one were available to them. So I think I will try to wrap up here and open it up to questions since we're down to about 5 minutes. I would like to just focus lastly on our financials. So I'm going to turn to this final slide here. And I apologize, I didn't have time to talk about our non-cancer programs, but we do have a program looking at neutrophil extracellular traps injection into white blood cells and how that may aid in triaging patients who have been diagnosed with sepsis, COVID-19, pneumonia, and or influenza. And I don't have time to really talk about that program in the time allocated, but encourage you to go to our website, read some of our press releases. This PowerPoint is also available on our website and has some good information on our non-oncology related clinical programs. So to wrap up, again, we're traded on the NYSE American, ticker VNRX. Market cap has hovered around the 200 million mark. Monthly burn of around 1.5 million per month. Cash on hand at the end of last year, 19.4 million. We took in about 4 million in grants and loans from the Walloon region of Belgium, where our lab is located, in January. We conducted a secondary offering in February with Cantor Fitzgerald, raised $20 million. So We're a little bit under $40 million in cash currently, given that we're here in April. So a very strong cash position. We don't have any need to go out and raise additional dilutive capital in the short term. Obviously, if our stock were to move up substantially from its current levels, we could consider the capital raise, but we're not in a position where we have to go out and raise capital currently. We're in a comfortable cash position. Insiders, we own about 17-18% of the shares. Institutions own about 25 to 30%. The rest are friends, family, and retail investors. 5 analysts cover the company: Zacks, Aegis, Benchmark, Maxim, and Cantor Fitzgerald. So thank you all very much for listening to the VolitionRx Limited presentation today. Feel free, as I mentioned, to go to our website, which is here, volition.com, which has a lot of good information on there. And hopefully all of you will continue to follow our progress over the course of this year and beyond. So I will turn to the Q&A session, and I'm just going to refresh the Q&A button. So it doesn't look like anyone has submitted a question so far through the Q&A portal. So if anyone does have a question, we have about 2 minutes here. Just go into your dashboard, and I believe you can enter a question. And I'll keep refreshing my screen in case anyone does have any questions. We've got about 2 minutes left. I'll pause for about 15 or 20 seconds to see if any questions come in. I am not seeing any currently. Okay, looks like one just came in. Future milestones in 2021. Good question. I encourage investors to continue watching for our veterinary sales. Hopefully we'll continue to ramp sales over the course of 2021. As I mentioned, we may or may not sign a licensing deal with a larger diagnostics company to license our vet blood test. There should be additional information on our enrollment and launch of clinical studies in our bloodborne cancers in the U.S., and hopefully some additional data from our lung cancer study in Taiwan over the course of 2021, and additional data from the work that we're doing looking at NETs and how a person's quantitative amount of NETs in their bloodstream can be prognostic for determining whether or not a patient will develop severe symptoms from sepsis, COVID-19, pneumonia, influenza. So we should have additional, ideally longitudinal data from that program as well. So it's a busy year, and as I mentioned, and we have a number of opportunities and sort of quote unquote shots on goal. So again, I think we're out of time. So can I thank all of you very much for dialing in for the VolitionRx Limited presentation today, and thanks to Planet Microcap Showcase for having Volition present today. Hopefully all of you will continue to follow our progress over the course of this year and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This does conclude today's webcast. Thank you for your participation and have a wonderful day.